Hello, I'm so excited to welcome you all to our Summer 21 Sybil's List. We are so excited once again to have Sybil Steinberg telling us what to read during this summer. And remember that you can always borrow these books from the Westport Library. You can put a hold on them. You can come in and join us and pick up the books, and we'd love to see you. So without further ado, Sybil Steinberg.
Hello, readers and friends, because you're all my friends, whether I know you or not. I'm glad to be back talking to you again about books. And as usual, I'm grateful to the Westport Library for making Sybil's List possible. First, the bad news. I've read 47 books since the last list I issued back in January. Good news, I vowed not to discuss all of them. I decided to keep the list at 25. That didn't quite happen. I'm up from that number a little bit. I won't give you a final count. But the really good news is that this presentation is on Zoom. You can stop watching and listening at any point, and I'll never know. You can leave the room and make popcorn or drink a beer. Everybody can relax. So now I'll start. Every list I prepare is a little different. I don't start out that way. It just happens sometimes that I see a different way to present the books. This time, I decided to list my top favorite fiction first. Some of them may have vanished under the radar, so I want to bring them to your attention. And FYI, the New York Times recently published an article recommending new summer reads. I've read some of them and they're terrific, but they're not included in this list because they'll be published in July or August. The books on this list are all current and available now. So here are my favorites to start with. Liberty by Caitlin Greenage. This lushly and lyrically written historical novel is powerful in its implications. It is set in Brooklyn during the Reconstruction era, where a young Black girl named Liberty has been raised by her mother, a revered homeopathic doctor. Her mother exists with the assumption that Liberty will follow her medical footsteps. But while Liberty's mother is quite light-skinned, Liberty herself is not. In fact, she knows that her dark skin has already set her apart. And she realizes that the white patients who are comfortable in her mother's care shrink from her own, Liberty's touch, when she tries to examine them. Drawn to music instead of medicine at a small Black college in Ohio, Liberty gradually discovers that her destiny might lie elsewhere. When she's afraid to admit to her mother that she has failed her pre-med courses, she impulsively marries a light-skinned Black man from Haiti who promises her that she will always be his equal. But when they return to Haiti, she is once again the victim of a pervasive attitude about color. She is shunned by her husband's light-skinned family. And again, she finds herself in search of the personal freedom that her name implies. Her painful, belated coming of age leads her to a decision that will finally be in compliance with the true meaning of her name. This novel is truly engrossing and honestly unafraid to offer truths about the plight, excuse me, of Black women in a color-struck society. Time for my first drink. The next book, again, didn't get wide coverage, but it's really wonderful. It's called The Secrets of Happiness by Joan Silber. This extraordinarily satisfying novel is comprised of 7 linked stories, each told by a narrator who may or may not know the connection between and among them. Each character adds something to the secrets revealed, and all of them subtly come to the conclusion that money does not always mean happiness. The first narrator is Ethan, a gay lawyer in Manhattan, who discovers that his father, Gil, whose career in textiles has always taken him on buying trips to the Far East, is indeed a bigamist. Gil has acquired another wife in Thailand and has brought her and their 2 children to live in Queens, right around the corner. Ethan and his sister and their mother have been totally unaware of their betrayal, which becomes worse when Gil has a stroke and chooses to live with his other wife. The fallout from Gil's betrayal spreads in intricate ways and spurs the range of settings in this novel to Chiang Mai, Bangkok, Dhaka, Kathmandu, and Phnom Penh, and then back to New York. The author renders the various settings with artful ease, and she develops the relationships among the diverse characters with emotional complexity, humor, and psychological nuances. Love is the overriding theme, and happiness is the shining secret. Coming along. Sorry. Sorry, I have lost my screen. Okay, sorry. I hope you can move this forward eventually, I hope. Here we go. Next, the Souvenir Museum by Elizabeth Mccracken. I feel that I'm giving you a gift when I talk about Elizabeth Mccracken. Every book she's ever written, novels and short fiction and memoir, is incomparable. The 12 irresistible short stories in this collection contain fascinating and sometimes eccentric characters who are loosely tied together by the bonds of family. In these stories, siblings and parents and lovers in different stages of relationships interact with new understandings. Mccracken writes with the utterly distinctive wit and humor that illuminate scenes of absurdist comedy or grief and loss, all observed with the passage of time. In the first story, a short, rather plump young woman called Sadie, and I digress to say that Mccracken herself is short and round. I've interviewed her to my everlasting delight. Anyway, Sadie has gone to Ireland with her boyfriend, Jack, for a wedding of one of his sisters in his large family. Jack's siblings and parents are eccentric in a lovable way. The weather that week is soggy with rain, and Sadie feels marooned while she tries to figure out family relationships, and she is surprised over and over again. These characters from the first story are further explored in 3 other linked stories in the book. The last story features Sadie and Jack 20 years later. Mccracken always constructs brilliantly detailed and acutely observed stories that are equal parts laugh out loud funny and almost heartbreaking in their understanding of the human condition. The Mysteries by Marissa Silber. This is her 2nd or 3rd book. She has written short stories previous to this. This one is really engrossing. 2 7-year-old girls whose intense friendship is the catalyst for this immensely affecting novel. It's set in St. Louis in 1973. Maggie Brenneman is headstrong, resolutely disobedient, and possessed of a fierce imagination. She's indulged by her anxiety-ridden father, who cannot deal with disruption because his family business is failing and he's afraid to tell his wife, Miggy's mother, who runs a ballet dancing school that Miggy, of course, obstinately disdains to join. Miggy's best friend is Ellen Gallagher, her complete opposite, a withdrawn, polite, quiet child who is nevertheless delighted to be Miggy's partner in some of the dangerous exploits that Miggy invents. Both girls have the type of fantasy worlds common to childhood. And the author describes their inner lives with psychological tenderness. The narrative grows in richness as the author explores the marriages of the girls' parents, revealing the tensions that have shaped each family. She portrays the inevitable gaps in intimacy that sustain misunderstandings. The terrible accident that creates an earthquake in all their lives comes as a shock to the reader and raises questions of guilt, grief, and individual responsibility. The poignant resolution brings Miggy to an understanding of the mysteries that confront human beings in this world. This next book is just coming out. It's a June publication called Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. I think this will be the big book or among the big books of this summer because the author constructs this breathtaking historical epic with amazing skill. It's filled with unforgettable characters who intersect through a century of dramatic action. The novel is, trust me, a must read. The action begins in 1914 when a luxurious ocean liner explodes in the Atlantic Ocean. The captain jumps into a lifeboat with his newborn twins. Unfortunately, many other passengers drown. He's sent to prison, and the twins, Marion and Jamie, are raised in a loving but desultory fashion by their uncle, an artist in Missoula, Montana. The twins basically bring themselves up as they're free to wander in the countryside. Jamie shows talent as a painter, while Marion, who is the heroine of this novel, becomes obsessed with the desire to become a pilot. She's still a teenager when she marries a rich man in order to fly his plane, smuggling whiskey during Prohibition. Then and later, she is thwarted again and again by the male establishment. She does manage to become a pilot during World War II when she flies dangerous missions in England. This is all gripping drama, and the narrative builds to the fulfillment of Marion's dream, her attempt to circumnavigate the globe by flying over the North and South poles. Meanwhile, another heroine's life is interspersed with Marion's. A century later, Hadley Baxter is a Hollywood star in a movie based on Marion's life. Great surprises and secrets are revealed. Shipstead's diligent research illuminates a century of historical and cultural events that form the rich background of the novel. I'm just giving you the briefest outline of an absorbing narrative that cannot be put down. Fair warning, it runs to 589 pages, but they fly like the wind, or like Marion's joy as she flies above the earth. The next book I call The Heavy Hitters. The authors of the following novels are familiar names whose books are always greeted with high anticipation. So they're in a class by themselves. They are the literary highlights of the season. The first is Kazuo Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun. He again imagines a dystopian world where technology has altered humanity. Clara is an AF, or artificial friend, created technologically to be a companion to a teenage human. In the special store where she's been on display, she shows unusual intelligence and intuition. She's chosen as a companion by Josie, a 13-year-old girl who is warm and friendly, but obviously Josie is suffering from a mysterious illness. As Clara discovers, Josie has been lifted, that's in quotes, by choice, having submitted to a technological genetic procedure that will enhance her intelligence. This procedure is dangerous, however, and Josie is often ill, at one point almost on the verge of death. That's when Clara discovers the essential ingredient of human life, which is love, a feeling that she herself has developed for Josie, although it's sacrificed to her own well-being. The tone of this novel is dark and menacing, deliberately mysterious and deeply philosophical, as Ishiguro speculates on whether the human species will be able to endure in a purely technological world devoid of the essential component of love. I was somewhat disappointed to find Ishiguro investigating much the same dystopian ground that he plowed in his previous novel, Never Let Me Go. But even so, the power of his imagination cannot be disputed. The Committed, again, a literary heavyweight, Vian Tan Nguyen, who had written The Sympathizers, widely read and justifiably well reviewed. In this book, with a torrent of words expressing moral, sociological, and philosophical theories and jokes, he continues the tragic comic life of the narrator in his first novel. Here, the narrator calls himself, he's renamed himself as Vo Dan, a humorous nom de guerre, because in Vietnamese, it means no name. As the novel opens, he's in deadly serious trouble. He has fled Vietnam after his torture and escaped from the re-education camp where he's been forced to confess his life as a double agent. He was a spy who served the communist rulers in North Vietnam while pretending to be an anti-communist activist in California. He describes himself as a spy, a sleeper, a spook, and a man of two faces. And he's haunted by the people whom he has betrayed and killed in his past. Here in Paris, he's employed selling drugs by a crime boss who runs a brothel named Heaven. It's a mortally dangerous occupation, and he is captured and tortured by a gang of French-born Algerians who are rivals in the drug trade. The scene of his torture is grisly, but even here, there is gallows humor in the narrative. Throughout, he's faced with an even more serious dilemma because he knows that the faceless man who tortured his brother Bon and him in Vietnam is also now in Paris. Throughout the novel, again, sustains running questions about the ways that former colonizers forget their crimes and how white men look down on people of color everywhere. At the novel's end, the narrator is recuperating from the slam-bang thriller aspect of the story and sadly mourning the waste of his two-faced life. But while it's studied with dramatic action, this is actually a cerebral book in which the reader is immersed in the dazzling ideas that the author spins page after page. My Year Abroad is by Chiang-Rai Lee, another writer who is justly celebrated for wonderful novels. Here he entwines two stories about 1 year in a young man's life. It's a turbulent, tumultuous, funny, sometimes harrowing novel, and it succeeds in spite of the author's frankly losing attempt to keep the narrative on track. Frankly, this is a book that goes all over the place. The protagonist is 20, living hidden sub rosa in a small California town with an older woman and her son who are in a witness protection program. Tiller met them in the Hong Kong airport when he was fleeing from the scene of the murder of his beloved mentor, a Chinese-American entrepreneur named Peng. Peng, a year ago, had convinced Tiller to delay the start of his college year abroad and instead to come with him to Asia, where they will market a new, supposedly miracle drink called Elixirant. Their adventures along the way are the stuff of Tiller's fantasies, except they're real. From a life-changing foot massage in Hawaii to scuba diving and sex and Shenzhen and Macau, with plenty of karaoke, singing, and binge drinking, and superb food in the mansions they visit. Meanwhile, though, Tiller has plenty of time to speculate about his racial identity in the wider world. He's been an outsider in American society. His part Chinese mother abruptly left him and his white father when Tiller was young. So he's 1/8 Chinese, and that doesn't keep the Asian characters from considering him a foreigner. And of course, he's also a foreigner in American culture. And the central theme here is the way that our culture is now global in a way that we don't recognize, and to the detriment of many people who are exploited to sustain the standards of comfortable living. I think that Chiang-Rae Lee bit off more than he could chew in this discursive narrative, but there are unforgettable scenes that are well worth the effort to hang on to the plot. The next book, again, an author of great acclaim, and going from the frenetic action of the overstuffed previous books to Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is a very slim volume with an entirely different affect. The sun-drenched atmosphere in this deliberately low-key novel reflects the unnamed Italian city in which it is set. This is especially relevant because the author, who is of Indian descent, as we know, wrote the novel in Italian and translated it in herself. A work of love, really. So the unnamed narrator is a single middle-aged woman with a comfortable teaching job that leaves her time to write, but she has no real meaning in her life. Her days are leisurely and relatively unfocused. In a series of meditative reflections, she thinks about a possible love affair with a neighbor, about an ex-lover she once had and why she ended the affair, about the seemingly satisfied lives of some of her friends. She's a woman whose life needs an emotional focus, and she is yet so accustomed to solitude and lassitude that she seems frozen in space in the grip of chronic depression. Her hopes and frustrations and her longing for connection seem about to be realized in the final section of the book, when she accepts an invitation to spend a year in another city. The book is observational, almost completely observational, without any action scenes. Yet it gradually reveals the deep unrest in the narrator's life as she may begin to navigate a passage to another emotional atmosphere. Sleep donation, Karen Russell, as we know, writes deeply imaginative and macabre fiction. This is a haunting novella set in the near future when an epidemic of lethal insomnia has swept over the globe. A young woman called Trish has become a recruiter for something called the Slumber Corps, a company that requests people to donate their sleep to insomniacs who are on the verge of death. Trish becomes a hero after she locates a newborn baby girl who somehow is not afflicted with the virus. Baby A becomes the first universal sleep donor. With her parents' permission, the baby is attached to a machine every night that siphons her peaceful sleep out of her brain so it can be injected into needy victims. Things seem to be getting better, but I won't tell you about the secret that lies in wait. Russell's dazzling imagination invests this dystopian work with surreal beauty and menace. Usually at this point, I would mention Cynthia Ozick among the heavy hitters. I revere her work. She is one of my favorite authors. I treasure the workmanship in every sentence she writes. But the sentences in her latest book, Antiquities, are as beautiful as ever, but I found that the novel as a whole didn't work for me. So it's not on the list, but I'm happy to discuss it offline with anyone who disagrees with my opinion. So now 3 newcomers. These are not first novels. They're second or third novels, but these are not household names. And I want to make sure that these books are read. The first is How Beautiful We Were by Mbolo Mbui, a multinational American oil conglomerate in cahoots with the corrupt ruler of a fictitious African country, is destroying the environment of a traditional village called Kosawa. Children are dying of toxic poisoning. Crops are failing, and the animals that hunters killed to feed the community have disappeared. After decades of having their pleas ignored, a group of young men led by Thula, a charismatic young woman who has studied in America, determined to ignite a revolution that will save their village. This tale, partly fable, partly an outraged call to action, is enriched by the author's compassionate understanding of all the people whose lives are destroyed by ruthless capitalism. The moral questions here are complex, as expressed by a kaleidoscopic cast of vividly portrayed characters. Mbui's elegiac tone, established in the first sentence of the novel, is this. This is how it reads. We should have known the end was near. How could we not have known? This tone is sustained throughout the complicated plot. The novel is sometimes too didactic, and some passages lag and impede the action. But at the end, readers will be haunted by the moral strength of this ambitious narrative. Just a little technological adjustment here, and let's see if things go better. The Arsonist City. Wow, don't I love doing Zoom? By Hala Alyan. The characters in this beautifully wrought novel by a Lebanese American writer are held together by family bonds, long-held secrets, and deep nostalgia for their roots in the Middle East. The author illuminates the recent history of Lebanon and Syria through the intimate lives of one family, the Nasser family. Idris Nasser, his wife Mazna, and their 3 adult children. In 1972, Idris, the son of a wealthy Lebanese family in Beirut, quickly wooed and married Mazna, a poor, beautiful girl from Damascus. They then left Beirut for his surgical residency in California, and there they have stayed ever since. Both partners in the marriage carried secrets and heartaches. Idris mourned the death of his best friend, a Palestinian refugee. Mazda secretly mourned for the same man whom she had loved in 2019, when Idris decides he must sell his ancestral house in Beirut, the family assembles for a cathartic revelation of secrets. Sorry. I'm really having trouble seeing the screen, and maybe this is it. Okay, we'll go back to it. Sorry, but I have to do this. I can't, it's swimming. I hope you can cut this out. I think you will. The author of this absorbing narrative is a poet as well as a novelist. Her prose is lyrical. She spins the narrative with tenderness and honesty, portraying her flawed characters with keen understanding and compassion. At the very least, she introduces us to a rich Middle Eastern culture that figures importantly in this era in which we live. Lebanon and Syria, important to understand those societies. Summer Water by Sarah Moss. During a drastically rainy week in August, 4 families on vacation in a park on a lake, a loch in Scotland, keep their distance, although they stare out their windows and speculate about each other. The author cleverly dramatizes the thoughts of 12 people, from an 8-year-old boy to an elderly woman in the first stages of Alzheimer's. The author is devastatingly acute in portraying the differences in social class, the stresses of romantic relationships and marriage, and the angst of bored teenagers. All the vacationers are aware of one family in an adjacent cabin that does not belong in this Scottish-British setting. They are foreigners, a woman and her young daughter from another country, a place the others refer to with clear bigotry as maybe Romania, maybe Poland, maybe the Ukraine. In other words, strangers to their inbred culture. Tension mounts until the final scene. The author is well known in Britain for her spooky situations and the precise crystalline prose in which she writes. Now I'm going to move to lighter fiction because I have been accused of recommending too many books that are heavy reads. So the following books have fast-moving plots, no challenging metaphors, no underlying messages, but they are well-written and very good reads. The first is Maude Dixon. Several secrets motivate the 2 women whose lives intersect in this clever literary thriller. Maude Dixon, this is the pseudonym of the author of a best-selling novel about a long ago murder. Her real name is Helen Wilcox. Helen needs an assistant, and she hires a young woman named Florence, who has just been fired from her job in a New York publishing company. Obviously, Florence needs the job. She's thrilled, and she's thrilled to meet the reclusive author. The 2 women travel to Morocco, ostensibly to research Helen's next book. But sinister events keep occurring. When Florence is mistaken from Helen, who has vanished, Florence decides not to reveal the mistake. She is determined to achieve her ambition to become a writer, and she figures out she can do so by becoming Maude Dixon herself. She turns out to be a ruthless character worthy of Patricia Highsmith. The twists and turns in this narrative are terrific. It is a great read. Outlawed by Anna North. This novel is just fun. In 1849, in a strict Christian rural community, 18-year-old Ada knows that she soon will be hanged as a witch because she is barren after a year of marriage. In this patriarchal society, women are raised to breed, So a woman who doesn't conceive must be evil. Ada escapes and races cross country as a fugitive, hoping to join the Hole in the Wall gang, who are hiding out in a secret place in the Dakotas. For us Westporters, the name Hole in the Wall gang has special resonance due to Paul Newman's Camp for Kids. But in this book, it's a vastly different concept, and it's very clever. This is an adventure novel that reinterprets itself as a feminist Western. The gang supports itself by robbery, which is a career path justified by its charismatic leader, a woman called the Kid, who preaches from the Bible as evidence that they are meant to thrive and succeed. Ada, who learned basic medicine from her mother, finds acceptance in the gang, but soon they are hiding from vigilantes. This warm-hearted portrayal of the gang community is enlivened by humor and deepened actually by danger and suspense. This unique depiction of what might have been is a very engaging read. Trio is by William Boyd, one of my favorite British writers. I don't think I've ever done a list that hasn't had a William Boyd book on it, and they are all, each one different from the other. This is a multi-character comic novel set in the British movie world. It's written with Boyd's consummate wit and brio. The titular character, the trio, consists first of Talbot Kidd. This is another character named Kidd, the closeted homosexual producer of a romantic movie, which she's making. It is titled, wait for it, Emily Bracegirdle's Extremely Useful Ladder to the Moon. This movie is being made in Brighton, England in 1968. The second member of the trio is Annie Viklund, the young American star who's carrying on a secret affair with her co-star, Troy Blaze. His real name is Nigel Farthingly. The third is Elfrida Wing, a blocked novelist and alcoholic who's married to the director, Reggie Tipton, who is changing his name to Rodrigo. Elfrida is trying to write a novel based on Virginia Woolf's suicidal last day on Earth. And she can't decide whether or not to emulate her protagonist by drowning herself. The movie lurches from crisis to crisis as Boyd manipulates his eccentric characters, his funny plots, and he skews the movie industry for all it's worth. A Liar's Dictionary by Eli Williams. Williams is again a British novel, and the double narratives in this offbeat, charming novel alternate between two lexicographers who are working on a fictitious dictionary in London, except they are doing it a century apart. In the present day, Mallory is the sole employee of the descendant of the family who published the original, though unfinished, multi-volume dictionary in 1910. Mallory's job consists of finding hidden Mount Weasels, that's M-U-N-T-W-E-A-Z-E-L-S, Mount Weasels. This is a real word, which are bogus, made-up words deliberately inserted in the text to protect intellectual property. And find them she does, and they are comically appropriate. That's the fun of reading this book, the words that she finds, and that seem to make a lot more sense than words we are reading today. And Mallory invents words as well, and they could have been invented by Lewis Carroll there. Some of them are really from Alice in Wonderland. It turns out that the original Mount Weevils were invented by a shy, awkward man called Winsworth, who got as far as the letter S in 1899 and fell in love with one of his fellow workers. And so does Mallory have her own love story. This is a novel for word-besotted readers who will find that the made-up words are absolutely delightful. The words that are made up in this book are as much fun as the plot itself. V for Victory by Lissa Evans. We again are in England. This historically accurate picture of London during 1944 and 45, the waning days of World War II, has a cast of vividly portrayed characters and a rare feel-good plot. Germany's bombs are still falling on London with regularity. Food and fuel are very scarce, and everyone has felt a personal or community loss. One character, warm-hearted V. Sedge, seen previously in the author's first novel, Crooked Hearts, which I highly recommend, is still running a hodgepodge boarding house on Hampstead Heath. She has assumed this alias, this name, rather than her true name for good and plenty reasons. She's still mothering the precocious, scholarly now 14-year-old orphan boy she has informally adopted. Another major character, Winnie, is an air raid warden captain charged with finding survivors after the nightly air raids. And her crew of volunteers is also portrayed with colorful energy. Evans alternates her characters' events adroitly and with rising suspense, and the atmosphere of war-drawn England is authentically portrayed. Should we stay or should we go? Lionel Shriver, despite the masculine name, Lionel is actually born an American woman with a very interesting past. But anyway, this book is just due out this month in June. Shriver I think this is her 11th or 12th book. Every one of them is different, and this one is a real page turner. So she sets all her novels in England. America is dim in her past. So this again is set in England, and it's fun. With a real sense of humor, Shriver has dreamed up a novel that has all the imaginative elements of an Alan Ayckbourn farce. In 1991, when they are in their 50s and in good health, Kay and Cyril, an upper middle class British couple, decide they don't want to spend their declining years so sick that they'll require care at enormous expense. They make a pact that they will commit suicide on Kay's 80th birthday. And in that spirit, deciding that their 3 children will never have to pay for their care, they feel free to spend all their money on trips abroad and bottles of good Cabernet. When the fateful day arrives, they take the second oil pills they have carefully saved for the purpose, or do they? Maybe one of them changes his or her mind. Maybe unanticipated circumstances arrive. Innumerable events can transpire to prevent their determinations to spare themselves the indignity of old age. Shriver plays out 13 different scenarios, each one a humorous variation on how their plans could and do go wrong. Readers, of course, those of us who are over 80 will acknowledge the dark edge under the laughable consequences of living beyond 80 years old. Now, nonfiction. The Code Breaker by Walter Isaacson, another writer of great gifts. It's an important account of the new biological tool of gene editing. It's seen through the achievements of Nobel Prize winner Jennifer Doudna. Her breakthrough discoveries directly enable the development of the vaccines for the coronavirus, among other things. The biological technology she invented can be enabled in the future to fend off other viral diseases, and it may indeed influence the future of the human race. Doudna and her colleagues invented the technology known as CRISPR, that's C-R-I-S-P-R, which allows bacteria themselves to develop an immune system that can destroy the viruses that attack them. So the story of how she and her team raced to discover the secrets of gene editing is fascinating. For the lay reader, and that's me, the explanations of how scientists identify a problem, how they work together, or how different teams fiercely compete for the same discovery is suspenseful. The author's range of information is amazing. In addition to revealing the potential contributions of recombinant DNA, he also explores the moral dilemma caused by a Chinese scientist's attempt to create designer babies and what dangers might lie ahead if scientists use this technology to influence a baby's IQ, it's quite possible, or to specify other enhancements. So bursting with new information and provocative information, this is a very useful and important book. The Age of Acrimony. The subtitle of this extremely timely study is How Americans Fought to Fix Their Democracy, 1865 to 1915. It shines light on one of the most tumultuous periods in our history. Now, the author writes the following. Americans claim that we are now more divided than we have ever been since the Civil War. But we forget that the era after the Civil War saw the loudest, ruthless political campaigns in our history. Presidential elections from the 1860s through the 1900s saw the highest turnouts, the closest margins, and the most political violence. Widespread political participation, which included hard drinking, raucously shouting, torch-wielding, armed mobs, were the norm until the reforms of the early 20th century, plus the invention of the voting machine. An incredible transformation of politics took place around 1900, the author writes, reconfiguring a public, partisan, passionate system into a more private, independent, restrained one. The author dramatizes and energizes his thesis through the lives of a progressive father and daughter political dynasty. Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Will Kelly, who was anti-slavery and a champion of the working class, and his daughter, labor activist Florence Kelly, highlight the dramatic transformation of American politics through the Gilded Age. The author says that the acrimony in American politics is the result of inherent social conditions. Politicians, and this is a quote, excite the mob sense of common anger, unquote. Voters driven by a cycle of outrage alternate between political parties, throwing out one set of bums and then the other. There's plenty to think about in comparing that era of history to our own tumultuous decade. The Agitators, subtitled Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. The author is Dorothy Wickenden, who has spoken in Westport before, and perhaps we will see her again. Again, this is a very timely book. The three friends whose lives are recalled in this well-researched book made important contributions to American history. All three women fought for abolition and women's rights during the 19th century and the Civil War. The first was Frances Seward. She was the wife of William Henry Seward, governor of New York, senator from New York, and later Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. Her friend, Martha Coffin Wright, was a Quaker mother of 7 and the sister of suffragist Lucretia Mott. Their interaction with and crucial help for Harriet Tubman, who guided slaves on the Underground Railroad and served as a spy and a nurse for the Union Army, is an exciting story. The narrative, which Wickenden calls a joint story of insubordination against slavery and the oppression of women, begins in Auburn, New York, where Seward and Wright were early anti-slavery agitators and fledgling supporters of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. After they became acquainted with Harriet Tubman, Seward actually joined the Underground Railroad, quite a risk in that her husband was serving in the government. She also gave some land that she owned, a house and 33 acres, to Harriet Tubman, who insisted on paying a modest mortgage. So Tubman's dangerous exploits add drama to the narrative, and the descriptions of Civil War battles add context. This is an important addition to our knowledge of American history. Janice Nomura wrote The Doctor's Blackwell, another story about important women in American history whom we knew very little about. The siblings who were responsible for allowing American women to earn medical degrees labored during a time, the mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century, when male physicians were almost entirely united in denying females the entry to medical school and private practice. Elizabeth Blackwell, the elder by 8 years, was sternly ambitious with a frosty demeanor. Emily, her younger sibling, had an easier personality, but she too had lofty goals and inflexible energy in achieving groundbreaking breakthroughs and advances in medicine. The Blackwell family had emigrated from Bristol in the 1830s. When their father died, leaving their mother and 9 children penniless, Elizabeth Blackwell was 18 years old. She felt that women could not achieve independence since they could do the same jobs as men. Medical schools in America would not grant her a diploma, so she trained at a maternity hospital in Paris. She returned to America, but after an arduous attempt and failure to be accepted as a private physician, she opened a free clinic for poor women in New York, and eventually Emily joined her. In 1857, the sisters raised enough money to found in 1857, the sisters raised enough money to found the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women in Manhattan. 10 years later, they created their own medical school that eventually merged with Cornell. Their dedication as female pioneers does not make them lovable characters, but their contributions to medicine are brilliantly told in this inspiring book. Notes on Grief by Chimamanda Adichie. We've all experienced grief in one way or another. It's always so difficult to endure and to describe. In a mere 67 pages, Adichie expresses her soul-shattering grief after her father, a distinguished college professor, died suddenly in Nigeria. On July 7th, 2020, the author and her 5 siblings, who are scattered around the world, participated in their usual family video phone call with their parents. That was July 7th. On July 10th, her father died of kidney failure. When that phone call came, the author writes, "I became undone." With the pandemic making it impossible to travel, she experiences and writes about bereavement in relative isolation. She etches out the stages of her shock and incapacitation. This is a quote. "Grief is a cruel kind of education," she writes. "You learn how ungentle mourning can be, how full of anger." She refers to grief's iron clamp on her body and mind. Gradually, over many days, but not a lot of pages, she recovers and she looks at life in a new way. Quote, "A new voice is pushing itself out of my writing," she says. There's an amazing amount of power in the pages of this slim book and a source of strength as well. 4 lost cities. The Annalee Newitz has a very interesting proposal in this book. She surmises that cities never completely disappear. She says that their populations scatter and resettle, and so the cities are never gone. So 2 of the cities described here are Pompeii and Angkor. We are familiar with the concept that they disappeared from the earth altogether. She shows that the eruption of Vesuvius was not a surprise, and that the emperor made sure that all the survivors were resettled in other places. In other words, he made sure that Pompeii's culture was preserved as its inhabitants affected the other societies in which they were blended. The demise of Angkor was due to a badly designed hydraulic system that caused floods, but was useless in times of drought. She shows that it faded away to become the city of Phnom Penh. So far, very interesting. The real surprises come with 2 cities that I had never heard of. In ancient Turkey, 9,000 years ago, we're talking Neolithic age, there was a mega village called Catalhoyuk. Clay houses were built one against the other, cemented into the other. The entrances and exits were on the roofs. So people used ladders to get in and out of their houses. They buried their dead between their own beds, under their own beds. So their ancestors were always with them. The city ended not in a big catastrophe, but when new social mobility allowed some residents to move into larger houses on the periphery and found a new community. That's upward mobility. Now, there was a city called Cahokia in what is America, in what is now East St. Louis, Missouri, where 30,000 Native Americans lived in a settlement composed of big black earthen pyramids on both sides of the Mississippi Mississippi River. The city was built as a place of spiritual pilgrimage for diverse groups of Native Americans. This city too died gradually as its spiritual traditions were absorbed by the Osage Indians and other tribes. Now, here's the point of this book. The author points out that all 4 of these cities were abandoned in times of, a quote, political instability and authoritarian nationalism. Thus, I was pretty interested in an article in the New York Times recently that was titled, "Is New York City Dead?" In other words, after reading this book, watch out. Mike Nichols by Mark Harris. Wow, what a great book. The legendary theater impresario had a life that could easily be turned into a complete dramatic production. In this wonderfully researched biography, the author documents the many milestones, triumphant or disastrous, that Mike Nichols observed during his 82 years of life. His youth was sad, lonely, and fractured by loss. While a youngster growing up in Berlin, an allergic reaction resulted in the total loss of his hair, head, eyebrows, eyelashes. When he was 7, he and his younger brother crossed the Atlantic Ocean alone. Their mother was too sick to travel to meet their father, a Russian-born physician in New York. Nichols' school years in New York as a bald boy with a German accent were an invitation for bullying. It was only when he arrived at the University of Chicago and met an interesting young woman named Elaine May that he discovered his career path. The author takes us through the classic Nichols and May improvisational sketches, and then an unparalleled degree, starting with Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park on Broadway and The Graduate on the screen. Nichols won 7 Tonys for directing, several Oscars. His personal life was flamboyant. He was rich, but he lived way behind his means, buying Arabian horses, penthouse apartments, and an estate in Connecticut. This book is about as irresistible as its charismatic subject. Walking with Ghosts, Gabriel Byrne. This Irish actor's memoir touches only lightly on his career. It's a lyrical, almost poetic portrait of his warm family upbringing in Dublin, his 4 years in a Catholic seminary. That's an interesting malaprop. In a Catholic seminary in England, where he lost his faith, his frantic desire to find a path in life, his addiction to alcohol because he felt lonely, vulnerable, and alienated, even as his acting career flourished. And then very gradually coming to terms with loss and love. Gabriel Byrne has an almost sensory memory, and his prose just sings with imagery. His courageous candor and his humor make this a literary standout. The Copenhagen Trilogy, this is by a Danish writer who is quite famous in her home country. And it's a memoir, a series of memoirs, actually, 3 of them issued together. It's like none other than I have ever read, and I've read a lot of memoirs. It's been called a sublime masterpiece. It's harrowing to read and impossible to forget because the author makes words work like magic. This is what she says. Childhood is like a coffin. You can't get out of it on your own. She writes this in the first third of the book, devoted to her upbringing in soul-scorching poverty within her parents' unhappy marriage. The street in Copenhagen where she lived held the stench of beer and urine. Yet in that atmosphere, she felt a compulsion to be a poet. She overcame the odds to have her first book of poetry published when she was not even 20 years old. The next section describes the flowering of her talent in short stories and novels, her friendships in a bohemian society, and the first two of her disastrous marriages. The third section chronicles in dispassionate terms her marriage to a doctor who provided the drugs, Demerol and methadone, that turned her into an addict. The last third of the memoir was originally published in Denmark in 1971, and the author committed suicide in 1976, leaving 4 children and the last husband who had tried in vain to make her drug-free. Festival Days by Joan Beard. Festival Days by Joan Beard. Beard writes in her own distinctive genre. It's a blend of fact and fiction, of essays and short stories, with no clear distinction between the real and the imagined. The essays in this collection read like stories, and the stories have the reality of nonfiction, and they're all amazing. One entry, Cherie, is from the point of view of a woman with metastatic cancer who decides to contact Dr. Kevorkian. It begins with the facts of her illness reported by her daughters and easily switches to the thoughts that could have gone through her mind at the end. And believe it or not, it's a very uplifting story, a life-absorbing story of a life well lived. In one essay, the author describes her method, which is as follows: words attached to memories, attached to images, and the images linked to form an idea at its core. Patchwork, called A Life Among Clothes, is by a British writer named Clara Wilcox. In a captivating series of lyrical vignettes, this memoir delves into the archives of her personal and professional lives by describing the fabrics of clothes and the other things that we wear. She is the fashion curator at London's Victoria and Albert Museum, and her patchwork of reflections celebrates both the treasured antique objects in the museum and the clothes that have played a significant role in her personal life. Wilcox writes in precise and sensual prose. Her reverence for the objects of history is almost spiritual, as she describes the duties of a fashion archivist, how items like lace and satin are folded, and how, when a box of medieval leather shoes arrived at the museum, the whole staff was sent home, while a specialist was called in to isolate the shoes in case they came from a plague pit. The milestones of her own life are interwoven in her portrayals of her parents and her marriage and the stillborn death of a baby and the later anxieties of marriage and motherhood. Her inspiration was to accompany each poetic moment with a photograph or drawing of the articles she described. And it's quite a beautiful book, a lovely book to hold in your hands. Now, the next 2 books are Holocaust Memoirs. My personal history, luckily, does not have to do with the Holocaust, but when I joined Publishers Weekly, when I joined the staff there in 1976, I became the reviewer of all the Holocaust books that were being published in rising numbers. Some I had already read, and I'm pretty sure I've read most of them published since that time. So it's an obligation I feel strongly. And I hope you'll bear with me when I discuss the following books, which I find very important. The first is called The Ravine. It's subtitled A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. It's a powerful narrative that records the individual lives rather than an accretion of facts and numbers. And this is what makes history come alive. The author is a historian of the Holocaust, and she started out by trying to discover the identities of the people in a photograph taken during the massacre of all the Jews in a Ukrainian town called Mariupol in October 1941. The photograph, of course, seen in the book, shows a woman being shot in the head as she tumbles into a mass grave. She is holding the hand of a little boy and has another child in her lap. The author tells us that the boy will be buried alive since the Nazis didn't want to waste bullets on a child. The men who shoot are Ukrainians from the same village and Nazi soldiers. But the author discovers that the photographer, rather than abetting and enjoying the event, secretly wanted to document this atrocity. He was a soldier from Slovakia, and later he became a member of the resistance, and he helped Jews in Slovakia during the war. So this is an inspiring book about one man's heroism, and a reminder of what the rise of fascism can do to minorities all over the world. The second Holocaust book is called The Light of Days, and this is subtitled The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos. It's about the many young Jewish women who served as couriers, leaders, and fighters with guns in Poland during the Holocaust. Her amazing research has revealed dozens of teenage girls and women in their early 20s worked in the underground under perilous conditions. Many of them were captured and faced torture and death, but only after completing deeds of exceptional heroism. The Jewish resistance that operated in more than 90 ghettos over Poland actually depended in large part on these women, and their story has largely been overlooked or forgotten. The author captures their extraordinary feats of courage. They smuggled guns and grenades and money and information hidden inside handbags, clothes, and loaves of bread. In confrontations with Nazi soldiers, they fought bravely and took casualties before escaping into the sewers and the forest. Many were debilitated by starvation and the emotional blow of seeing their families and friends captured. Yet their will to carry on was astonishing and inspiring. The esteemed Westport writer Nechama Tech is listed in the bibliography of this book, and Steven Spielberg has bought the rights for a movie version. Now, I couldn't end this with a downer, so I will end it with a universal favorite. I will end it with universal favorite. Okay, let's go. I couldn't end this with a downer. Guess we're both tired. We are both so tired. Now, I couldn't end this with a downer, so I'm ending it with a universal favorite, Shakespeare in America. By James Shapiro. This insightful analysis of how Shakespeare has been read, viewed, debated, and embedded in our national consciousness, explores the ways that the bard has been played during different periods of American history. For one thing, President John Quincy Adams declared that Desdemona was a sexual deviant for marrying Othello, a Black man. In another decade of our history, the diminutive Ulysses S. Grant was cast as Desdemona. That is the correct pronunciation, not Desdemona as we had been raised. It's Desdemona, in a production in the Army. And later on, both Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth were obsessed by Shakespeare. For Lincoln, it was Macbeth. Booth considered himself another Brutus and cited the death of a tyrant from Julius Caesar after he shot the president. Recently, a production of Julius Caesar in Central Park was shut down after right-wing protests because the title character seemed to resemble Trump. Apparently, Steve Bannon tried adapting Coriolanus for the movies as well, because it is the portrait of a strongman leader who refuses to be hemmed in by the rule of law. Let's hope that the current administration will be compared to All's Well that Ends Well. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Sybil. And for this list in print, feel free to just go to westportlibrary.org, and happy reading.